Hey guys, Brian Schultz here with Cape Falcon Kayak, and welcome to the 6th video in our series where we are building a small rowing and sailing boat out of skin-on-frame construction. Now, if this is your first time with this series, at the very least, go back to the video before this one and watch that first, because we recently reset this project and started a new boat, which is the one you see here next to me, and that video is going to tell you all about what this boat is and why we chose it, and the work that we've done so far. Now, if you want a deeper background, make sure that you go back and watch the first video in the series where I talk all about my own personal history building larger boats out of skin-on-frame construction. I show you all the boats that I've built in the past, and I talk about what I learned from each one of those, and then I kind of give an overview of what we're hoping to accomplish with this design series. So that's the background here. Also, if you're new to the channel, once again, my name is Brian. I've been building skin-on-frame boats for over 20 years. I offer online video courses and plan sets for how to build skin-on-frame kayaks and canoes. All right, so starting out with just a quick recap on what we've done up until this point in this design series. We started out by building a rowing and sailing dinghy called the Shearwater, which was designed by Joel White. And the reason I was building that boat first is because I had a commission to produce that particular boat, and I thought it would be a great opportunity to show you guys why you don't just want to grab any random boat plan and try to convert it into skin-on-frame without first understanding what types of boats work well with skin-on-frame construction, and also really taking the time to analyze your needs. Because if you don't do those things, you can back yourself into a corner where you end up spending so much more money and so much more time than you were originally planning, and sometimes you end up with a boat that really doesn't work well for you and you end up not using it. And the whole point of what I do here at Cape Falcon Kayak is trying to design things out of skin-on-frame that are really quick and really easy to build, that are really well matched to what people want to do, so these boats actually get used as opposed to just sitting in the backyard getting neglected, which is exactly what happened to my first skin-on-frame shearwater build. So anyways, that was the first boat that we started building. Unfortunately, my customer for that boat disappeared, and so I decided to go ahead and put the shearwater project on hold and go directly into the boat that I actually want to build, and the boat that I'm hoping I will eventually turn into a plan set and a video course, and that is the St. Lawrence River Skiff that you see next to me here. Now, if you want all the dimensions on the St. Lawrence River Skiff and also why I chose it as this particular build, once again, you can find that in the video before this one. But as far as what I had actually done to it in the last video, I'd laminated up these gunnels into a curve here. I'd gone ahead and made the keel and the stems. I cut all the stringers, and I made these laminated frames. There's one here, one in the middle, and one at the other end. And then I temporarily connected all of that together so I could figure out my bevel angles for the frames, and also for the stringers, and also for where the gunnels are going to connect to the stems. And then what I've done over the last week here is I took that whole temporary frame apart, and then I went ahead and accomplished all that work. So what I'm going to do here in this video is I'm just going to walk you through all the progress that we've made over the last week. I'm going to talk about all the individual construction tasks. And then I'm also going to talk about a bunch of the mistakes that I have made as well, because a big part of what I do here is just experimenting, figuring out what works. That way, when I'm ultimately making plans and video courses, you guys don't have to start from scratch and waste all the same time and money that I wasted to figure stuff out. You can just follow the plan, build the boat, and it's going to end up right the first time. So I've got lots of embarrassing stuff to share with you here today as far as things I screwed up and things that I learned. And then also at the end of this video, I'm going to give you guys a steam bending demonstration, because you can see that I've got some ribs in here. I steam bent those in yesterday. A few of them are not the right length, so I'm going to go back and I'm going to remeasure, and I'm going to steam bend in some new ribs, give you guys a good opportunity to see how that process works. So why don't we come in close on the boat here, and I'm just going to talk about everything we've done over the last week. All right, so picking up where we left off last time, you remember I had this whole thing temporarily set up with screws and clamps so I could find the length of the gunnels, the length of the stringers, the bevel angles, where those connect to the stems, and then also I needed to figure out the rolling bevel angles that I needed to cut on the ends of the stringers so they would lay properly on the ribs, and then also the bevel angle that I needed to cut on these frames right here so the stringers would go across those. Because you can twist stringers a little bit to follow those lines, but there's a limit to how much you can do that. Now, I got all that done, figured out all my angles, and then as I was disassembling this, I realized that I had made a couple of major mistakes. Now, before we talk about what went wrong here, I just want to mention really quick that the big challenge of being a skin-on-frame designer is that skin boats are constantly changing shape throughout the building process. Because unlike a regular wooden boat where you just build a mold and then you freeze that shape with planking or fiberglass and strips, with a skin boat, every new framing member that you add is introducing tension. So just to give you an example, on this particular boat, the plan set shows a 10-inch deep shear line, and these gunnels are laminated up out of 3 different pieces so we can create that curve. Now, if you have a boat that has flared gunnels, there's an additional layer of mat that we have to introduce into that because that's also going to affect the shear curve, but this boat has plumb gunnels, so we don't need to think about that. And so if this was one of my skin-on-frame canoes, I would laminate this curve 1 inch deeper than I know that I'm going to need, because I can expect to lose about a 1/2 inch to spring back after I take off all the clamps, and another 1/2 inch during the building process. So that's exactly what I did for this boat. I laminated this up to an 11-inch deep curve, and then I got everything together here, and I realized that this didn't lose 1 inch of shear, it actually lost 2 full inches of shear, which means that I am an inch low at either end of this boat. Now, as far as whether or not that actually affects the performance is negligible, but the point is, it's not what it was supposed to be, even though I already had experience laminating these kinds of shears. Now, why this happened, I can't even begin to imagine. I know that it has something to do with the fact that I'm building from the bottom up here, which is completely different than how I build my skin-on-frame canoes. There could be some twisting at the intermediate points here, which would bring the ends down a little bit. Also, I am resisting a lot more tension in this frame with this bottom board configuration and these bigger stringers than I am in my canoes, which are a little bit more lightly framed. Also, something else that might be having an effect is for this particular gunnel, I added a harder and stiffer layer of Douglas fir on top of these 2 layers of red cedar. And the reason I did that is because I love red cedar because it keeps the boat nice and light, but the tops of red cedar gunnels tend to get beat up pretty badly. So I figured for this boat, I would put a little bit harder piece of wood on here. However, harder is also stiffer, which means that it's going to force a little bit of shear out of the lamination. So I decided at the last minute to screw my gunnels back together and just use my power planer to cut down about 1/8 of an inch off the top of this Douglas fir, and then I remeasured the depth of the shear curve, and sure enough, it actually gave me about 1/8 of an inch of shear back to this lamination right here. So that's something to think about in the future. I think ideally what I would like is an 1/8 inch thick layer of hardwood like mahogany on top, and then the rest of this just be something like red cedar, but unfortunately that creates some complications with the laminating process, so this is kind of a compromise. All right, now moving on to the next big mistake that I made. As I was taking all the clamps off of this that were holding the ribs temporarily to these laminated frames, something that I failed to account for was that all of the weight of those clamps was actually pushing the keel flat against the reference surface right here, because I had forgot to put a shim underneath it to keep the rocker at the curve it was supposed to be. And you would think that really wouldn't create much of a problem, but what it did was it changed the angle of the keel between this point and the bow to be slightly steeper like this. And what that did was it projected the stem backwards a little bit, and that's a huge problem because I had just cut the gunnels to that length. And so once I actually blocked up the keel in this area back here to where it was supposed to be, and then I tried to fold the gunnels back into the stem, they were sitting about 2 inches further back here than they were supposed to, which is a massive problem because I really didn't want to take the time to remake these gunnels. Now, as far as what I actually did about that, I basically just forced this stem back under tension when I put this back together to screw and glue it together. That is not a good solution because it's putting a lot of tension in this wood, and it's putting a lot of stress on this joint, and it's putting a lot of stress on this joint. And so that's what I had to do to get this prototype to work without rebuilding these gunnels. But that's something to keep in mind when I'm creating my videos and plan set for how to build this boat, to remind people during the temporary setup, you have to remember to put a shim underneath this frame right here so you don't accidentally cut your gunnels too short. So a couple fairly significant mistakes there, but fortunately nothing so catastrophic that I would have to start over with this particular prototype. I can just wait until the next boat to solve those problems. So at that point, before I took everything apart, I just took a few minutes to figure out the seating geometry for this boat. I think I mentioned this in the last video, but one of the challenges with this particular prototype is I'm going to be adding a pedal drive adapter box the same way that I do with my skin-on frame canoes. And that requires a fairly precise seating geometry. So I took the time to figure that out, and then I decided to pause for a couple days and just go ahead and make the frames for the seats and also the seat backs, because that's one of my less favorite things to do. And I like to get that stuff out of the way early in the build, so at the end, when I want to get on the water, I'm not spending that time making seats and rudders and everything else like that. So took the time to make the seating frames and the seat backs, and then I just disassembled this entire frame, and I went ahead and did my final cuts for the bevels for the ends of the gunnels, the ends of the stringers. Also, I cut the rolling bevels on the ends of the stringers so they end up mating with the ribs. And then I took these laminated frames, the ones that are towards the ends of the boat, I clamped them down to my workbench, and then I just used a block plane and a protractor to cut those rolling bevels onto the outside surface. That way they match up with the angle of the stringers right here. Also, after I cut those rolling bevels, another thing I did was notch the outside of this laminated frame here so the gunnel would sit in far enough so the outside edge of these ribs would be in the same plane as the outside edge of this laminated frame. That way the stringers are going to flow smoothly across all these surfaces. So next I got a little bit carried away with some varnish work, which is something I generally avoid in skin-on frame boats. And the reason that varnish is not a good match for skin-on frame is that there's so many complex surfaces that it's really hard to encapsulate all the parts, and it's impossible to refinish those parts, which means that ultimately the varnish is just going to break down over time, and you're going to get water intrusion, which actually promotes rot as opposed to sealing it out. So normally what we do with skin-on frame is just put a heavy coat of oil over the entire frame, and then we let it weather naturally. However, in this case, I needed to add a little bit of varnish to this pedal drive adapter box because this is covered with epoxy, and epoxy doesn't have enough UV resistance. So I got out some Total Boat Halcyon, which is a water-based varnish, which doesn't lay down nearly as nicely as a oil-based varnish, but it is a lot less toxic, and it is super fast to put on because you can put the coats on once every hour with no sanding in between. So anytime you're doing varnish work, you want a minimum of 5 coats and preferably 7. I started putting coats on this, and you know how it goes with varnish. You paint something, it looks pretty, and then you're like, hey, maybe I should paint something else. So I started working on this keel here, and the way that I justified this to myself is that in the bottom of my boats, there's usually a lot of dirt and a lot of fish blood, and that tends to make the keel look pretty ugly pretty quickly. And so encapsulating this in varnish, this is just gonna be aesthetically a little bit nicer. And so I started out my 5 coats on the keel here, and then I got sidetracked and I started varnishing these frames right here. And then at that point, I realized I was out of control. So I stopped myself, I didn't varnish anything else. And then the ribs and the stringers are gonna get oiled because you'd never wanna varnish these because you can't get varnish into these rib junctions here, which is just gonna cause water to penetrate and then get trapped behind the varnish. So once I had all those pieces finished, next thing I did is I just brought everything back inside here and I did another dry fit just to make sure everything was going to fit together before I put glue on it and made everything permanent. So checked everything, made a few adjustments, and then also put more temporary screws in because anytime I'm gluing together a frame like this, I like to have things screwed together instead of just trying to clamp it against marks, because oftentimes the glue obscures the marks and also things can slide all over the place and you can end up with some pretty bad results. So basically what I did from that point was I just mixed up some thickened epoxy. The only reason I used epoxy as opposed to say Gorilla Glue for this is because I've been working with it for other things on this particular project. I wouldn't necessarily use Titebond along the keel because that gets submerged a lot. There's usually water sloshing around the bottom of a boat and it's not rated for continuous submersion, although honestly it would probably be fine. So anyways, put glue on all those surfaces. I went ahead and screwed and glued the frames to the keel. I screwed and glued the stems onto the keel as well. And then I screwed and glued the gunnels onto these frames here, and then also screwed and glued the ends of the gunnels onto the stems. So that was the starting of that armature. I let that dry overnight. Next day I came back and I went ahead and clamped all these stringers on where they were supposed to be. And then I got out my drill and some nails. And this is going to seem a little bit weird to some people because most people think skin on frame is always lashed together. But the reality is, if we're talking about historic boats only, about a third of all the existing historic boats in museums are nailed together as opposed to being lashed together. And there are upsides and downsides with nailing and lashing. The upside to lashing is that oftentimes, surprisingly, it's quicker than nailing something together. Also, you're not compromising the wood, meaning that you're not creating little spots for water to be able to get in and create deterioration of the wood. Also, you can correct for wobbly lines if you've lashed something together because you can push the stringers up and down. And so you could just as easily lash this entire boat together. The reason I chose nails for this is because it gives an extra amount of stiffness to the frame. And when I'm thinking about a skin boat that I want to be able to sail, I don't want that framework sliding around past itself. I want things to be as stiff as possible because even with the stiffest skin on frame boat you can build, you're still going to see a significant amount of flex under sail. And so I went ahead and after carefully checking that all the lines were fair, I nailed the stringers with bronze ring nails onto the outside of the laminated frames. And then for the stem to stringer joints toward the end of the boat here, I did actually switch back to lashings with no glue. And the reason for that is if I were to put a nail right at the tip of these stringers here and you get a good flex over a wave or something like that, there's a chance that it's just going to split out this end right here. And so in this case, I do actually prefer this lashing because it gives me a stronger joint and it gives me a little bit of mobility. So with all of that work done, last thing we needed to do is figure out how we were going to fit these ribs into the boat. So the idea behind this is not exactly rocket science. Basically, all we need to do is figure out how long these ribs need to be, and then we need to get a steam bendable species of wood. In this case, I chose Oregon white oak because it is the best bending wood in the world as long as it hasn't been kiln dried. I cut way more of it than I actually needed because when I'm working on a prototype like this, I usually burn through a lot of ribs so I can figure out the shaping and the bending system. And then I put that in my steam box until it was nice and flexible, and then I would pull those ribs out. And what I started out with was by just pushing the ribs in longer than they needed to be and then clamping them at the gunnels and then cutting them off at the height of the mortise so they would drop into these mortises. And I realized right away that was not a good system because I just didn't have enough time to make the cuts on the ends and I wasn't getting really smooth shaping. Because one thing you don't want to try to do is just force a rib down against the stringers, because even though these stringers are held by these frames here, there's still quite a bit of flex between them. And if you just push the wood against the stringers, what's going to happen is it's going to create some really wobbly lines on the boat. So I figured a much better approach would be to predetermine the length of these ribs. And rather than explain that to you, why don't I just show you what I did? So we're just going to go ahead and get rid of this rib right here because we're going to replace it. It's a little bit too short. And then the way that I figured out the length for these ribs is I started by cutting myself a super thin batten out of some perfect wood. That way it's going to bend to a nice even curve. And then I slide that into the opposite rib mortise and then just flex it up against the inside of the stringers. And in this case, I can actually push against the inside of the stringers because this is a thin piece of wood and it flexes a lot more easily. And then switching to the other view, I can just continue flexing this up the inside of the stringers until I get to the mortise location. And what I actually did for all the ribs that I bent into the boat was I just leaned over and kind of looked at where the mortise stopped, and I marked it with a pencil, and then I made a story stick with all those lengths, took it over to my workbench and cut all the ribs to length. But what I realized when I actually got to the steam bending process is that is not a very accurate way to mark these heights. And a lot of these ended up a little bit too short. Some of them are way too short, and I ended up having to replace a lot of ribs. So an idea that I came up with just this morning when I was thinking about making this video is, what if I made a jig that I could actually put over the rib like this, where this would reference the height of the mortises, and then all I have to do is mark it right here. And theoretically, this should give me a more accurate measurement. Now, the tricky thing is here is whether this is actually going to be the correct measurement, because there's a big difference between a very thin batten and an actual full-size piece of bending wood. And the only way we're going to figure that out is by just doing the experiment. So I'm going to go ahead and grab a piece of my bending oak, and I'm going to cut it to the same length as this batten. I'm going to fire up the steam box, and I'll see you guys in just a couple minutes. So while we're waiting for that steam box to heat up, I just want to take a couple minutes here to talk about the last and definitely the most serious mistake that I've made on this boat so far. So you've already seen how we've got those 3 laminated frames down the length of the boat to support the stringers, so we can use temporary battens to find the rib lengths. But towards the ends of the boat here, there's a much longer unsupported span, and even if we were just using battens to figure out these rib lengths, we wouldn't end up getting the right shape in this area. So for that reason, I drew up one more of the stations from the plans to fit halfway between the end of the boat and the last laminated frame here. And instead of just making a laminated frame, which is something I would do if this was a longer boat, if this was an 18-foot boat, we would absolutely have 5 laminated frames instead of 3. I just went ahead and drew it up in plywood so I could fit it down in here like this. And then you probably can't see this, but I've got some little holes in here, and then I can zip tie the stringers to these holes. And that's going to hold this shape so I can bend these ribs in without them pushing the stringers into a shape that's not supposed to be there. So what's the problem here? The problem is that this form you see right here isn't actually the form that I originally drew up for this location. This is a form that I had to make after the fact when I figured out that the form for this location was not going to fit. And I had a good reason to believe this because I did actually loft this curve out full size. And at least as a batten on a flat surface, the curve that came off of these other 3 points was very close to the width that was supposed to be here. But for whatever reason, the actual tension of the gunnels is much different than that. And when I tried to force the other form down in here, it was not even close to fitting. So this is a pretty major screw up. And the only silver lining here is from about this point downwards, the boat is still identical to the original lines. And so where this would come into play from a performance point of view is if you got caught out in a storm where you've got much rougher water than you should ever be taking a boat like this, that's where you're going to find the deficiency of not having a little bit of extra volume and a little bit of extra flare right in this area right here. So once again, not a deal killer for this particular prototype, but definitely a problem I'm going to need to solve so when we actually turn this boat into a plan, the lines turn out the way that they're supposed to and not the way they are right now. All right, so steam box is nice and hot here. Looks like we're making a decent amount of steam. I've got my bending gloves, I've got my bending belt, I've got a couple ribs here that we're going to be replacing. And then over here in my extremely messy workspace, I've got what I like to call the rib hospital. And this is basically just a little spot where I can make quick changes to a rib if it's not fitting quite right. Got a piece of wood I can cut on, got a couple different saws and a block plane. And then back here, I've got my phone with an interval timer on it. So I'm just gonna go ahead and start that right now. And we're gonna come back over to the steam box. We're going to slide in the first rib. And if you're wondering what the interval should be, there's no real fixed answer to that question. It just depends on the species of wood, the moisture content, how hot your steam box is, how many ribs you're going to have in at a time, and therefore how often you're going to be pulling them out. It's really a moving target, and so the best way to figure out steaming interval is literally just to take some of the scrap from your bending stock and then fire up your steam box and test it at different times until you find what time it's bending the best. So I'm going to go ahead and cover that. All right, we're coming up on our interval here, so I'm just going to pull this back and all right, we're going to go ahead and slide the other one in. And then next time the interval comes around, I'm going to pull this one out here and we're going to put it in the boat. All right, so that's our interval. I'm going to reach in here and pull this rib out. And just because I'm bending this into a form doesn't mean I don't need to have to pre-shape it. You can see here, I'm really aggressively bending the ends. Okay, and now we're going to come across. And then I'm going to push it along the inside right here. And I could just shove this in really hard right now, but what I want to do first is actually bend this back like this so it follows this shape. Once again, we don't want to really push hard on these stringers here because you'll distort the shape of the boat. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stick that in. That's actually a little bit tighter than I want, but I'm going to go to the other side and work the shape. Same thing, I'm just going to bend this and kind of keep an eye on the shape that I'm making. Okay, that is actually a little bit too long. So the way we're going to fix this, I'm going to come over to the rib hospital here, and I've got two choices for different blade widths that I can use to trim this. In this case, I only need to take off about a 32nd, and then I'm just going to cut. And that's how you can take off just a tiny amount, but accurately. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and put this back in. And hopefully that just drops in there perfectly. Okay, so last thing I need to do is just take a look at the rib, and if the rib surface is twisting away from the stringers, I'm going to come in here with a clamp, and usually just one clamp per side is enough. That way this is going to sit nice and flat in the mortise, and it's not going to be angled on top of the stringers. Not usually a problem in the middle of the boat, but you really have to work to fight that once you get towards the ends, which is why I have so many clamps on the boat right now. All right, so I'm way over time on my interval here because we're filming, but I'm going to grab this next rib, and this is going to be rib number 2 that we're going to be replacing. I'm going to go ahead and bend this in half. And I let this cook for too long, so there's a good chance it's going to break, but we'll see. This particular rib has a really tight bend. Okay. All right. Pop out the old rib number 2. We're going to push this down in here. And Okay, there we go. And just like before, I'm going to try to shape this to the inside of the stringers. You don't want to just push it down in there because it won't form the right shape. And just like I mentioned a minute ago, if this rib isn't sitting mostly flat to the stringer, you're going to want to grab yourself a clamp while this rib is still warm and flexible. Clamp it on like that. That way, when you go to fasten these down permanently, whether you do it with nails or lashings, it's going to sit nice and flush right here. And if you still can't get it down with a clamp, what you can do at this point is you can actually pull it out of its mortise and physically twist it like this. And then when you put it back in, you should be close enough that you can get the rest of the work done with the clamp. All right, so that went relatively smoothly. I'm happy with the finished result, at least. The only downside is that now that I've unequalized the length of that rib to its neighbors, I'm gonna have to go in and redo all the ribs in that particular section as well. And this is another reason that it's good to wait for someone like me to figure this stuff out in advance, because if you're talking about bending oak, you're burning sometimes $4 to $5 per rib just in experiments like this, and that can get pretty expensive over time. Also, it's worth pointing out that this is just the first part of this ribbing experiment here, because these ribs have a high moisture content, which means that they're going to shrink over the course of the next week. And as I watch how much these shrink, I can figure out how much more length I need to build in to that jig. That way they end up the actual correct length. Because if you were to just bend these in right now and nail them off to the gunnels and the stringers, what could potentially happen is that as they shrank, it would pull the fasteners up and out of those pieces of wood, which would be pretty much a disaster. You'd basically have to try to pry all those ribs out of the frame without breaking the frame, and then you'd have to replace all those ribs again. And those are exactly the types of situations that I like to help people avoid by being the guinea pig myself. So anyways, what I'm going to be doing over the course of the next week here is I'm going to wait for these ribs to dry, see how much they shrink. If they shrink a lot, I might have to go into the mortises and actually fill the tops of those mortises with some epoxy. That way everything's nice and tight in the frame. In the meantime, I'm going to just try to get done everything else I can on the frame. I'm going to make the rub rails that go on the outside of the skin and hold the skin against the gunnels here. I'm going to make the inwales that I'm ultimately going to use to cover the inside of these ribs. I'll probably do some more work on the seating. I'll build the rudder, and that should give me enough work that next time we get together here, I can show you guys pretty much a completed frame. And then in the last video after that, we'll go through all the skinning, and hopefully we'll even get this thing on the water. So anyways, that's where we're at right now with the skid-on frame St. Lawrence River skiff. As usual, if you like this video, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. Also, if you're interested in this skin-on frame boat or any of our other skin-on frame boats, make sure you check out our website, capefalconkayaks.com, where I have skin-on frame building video courses, plan sets, and various free skin-on frame resources. You can also find us on Instagram at Cape Falcon Builds, where we post photos and videos of whatever we're building in the shop or whatever we're testing out on the water. And you can find that same content on the Cape Falcon Kayak Facebook page as well. So that's it for now. Take care, be safe on the water, and I will see you next time.